Hey everyone, I am reading Forbidden Love by Lisa Jones-Gentry, as told by their son Joe Steele, presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Author's Foreword. When Joe first told me the story of his birth parents, Sister Sophie, a white Catholic nun, and Father William Grau, a black Catholic priest, I was immediately captivated. I knew that it was a true love story that should be shared with the world, and when Joe recounted how he sat by Sophie's side in her hospital room as she told him of her love for Father Grau, and how after Joe's birth and adoption that love continued as Sophie and Father Grau lived together in the rectory, where Sophie worked as Father Grau's housekeeper until his death in 1964. I sensed that this story was truly very special and one that would resonate with anyone who has been touched by adoption, whether as an adopted child, a birth parent, or an adoptive parent. I also believe strongly that all people, regardless of race, religion, or gender, will connect with the love story of these two people, because their story is at its core about courage and the determination to love regardless of the seeming restrictions that went through the voluminous notes that Joe had taken while sitting at Sophie's side, as well as his own recollections of his childhood and audio tapes that he'd recorded of some of his family members recounting special moments during Joe's childhood. Joe's personal stories are poignant and at times hilarious, and add a dimension to the book that gives the reader a complete view of the three lives that intersected at Joe's birth, only to be rejoined again when Joe reunited with Sophie in 91. The events in this book span from 1909, the year that Joe's birth father, Father Grau, was 4 years old himself, a biracial child raised in Cleveland, Ohio, by his Irish-American mother and her German-American husband, continuing through 1955 when Father Grau and Sophie first met at the Catholic parish in Lackawanna, New York, to Sophie's death in 2007. One of the unique things about this book is the personal window that it affords into one of the most turbulent times in our country's history. Sophie's detailed recollections of the challenges that they faced, including threats to their lives, sheds new insight into this critical period. I chose to write the book from the unique viewpoints of Joe and of each of his birth parents, and the tremendous amount of detail that Joe had amassed through his conversations with Sophie made this possible. As a writer, I journeyed through the lives of Joe, Sophie, and Father Grau, and often felt as if each was speaking through me as I wrote, so much so that I found it difficult to write the end of the book where Father Grau dies, but in so doing I became aware that his presence still lives on through Joe and through each of you who will read my story. My sincerest hope is that you enjoy the book, that you feel the lives of the chapters, and that their story connects with your personal story in a way that will both inspire and empower you, as it did me, Lisa Jones-Gentry. It began, Hudson, New York, 2006. I had the dream again. I'm trying to force my eyes open and wake up from the horror of what just won't go away. The images are swirling, like the bodies in the air being knocked back and forth as if they were no more than feathers floating lightly in the wind. I can still smell the burning flesh. I can still see the gaping hole in the huge tower, flames consuming it, licking the sides hungrily until one giant explosion levels it. Yet I can't pull away. My face presses against the glass of the building that by a few feet missed the same fate as the one in front of me. The World Trade Center, an icon of power and strength, now nothing more than a mass of rubble before my eyes. I want to wake up, but yet I cannot. Something lays the hard hand of sleep on me, and instead I twist and turn, trying to escape the memory that won't go away. And now I'm in a different place and seeing through different eyes. I look at my hands, the same but not quite. Something is scratching my throat. It's uncomfortable and stiff, some type of collar. My clothes are heavy and bulky. I can feel that they're wet. I can smell the mustiness around me. The same sound, the same bombing. Bodies flying through air. But this time my face is not pressed against a glass skyscraper. This time the bodies are just feet in front of me. In the distance, I see the outlines of what seem to be cavernous Renaissance villas barely standing, pockmarked with holes. I hear voices. I recognize it as Italian, and as I gaze deeper, my eyes grow accustomed to the darkness. I can hear the sound of airplanes circling overhead, and as one comes closer and closer, it's followed by the sound of more explosions and crashing and crying and men running back and forth. My feet are wet. I'm in a pool of muddy water, and as I look down, I see what I expect to be my face, but it's not. I expect to see my eyes, but they're not. Similar, but not the same. And I look through those eyes that are not mine but yet feel like mine, and I hear a voice. You must tell them my story, and a shudder goes through me as another bomb explodes and I wake up. Everything is quiet now. The only sound is the ticking of the clock. Rubbing my eyes, trying to get the memories out of my head, the memories that won't go away, I lie back on my bed. My heart is still pounding. It's 2006, but for a moment, just a moment, I was back there on September 11th, 2001. Then to another time, a time before there was a me, a time that I'd only read of, but yet I experienced in a dream, as real as if I were there, and I know that it was him. He has spoken to me like this before over the years, but never with such clarity and force. I lie back, longing for the comfort of an empty mind, one that is not fraught with images of death and dying, but somehow I know that unless I know the story that he's been trying to tell me in bits and pieces, these images will never leave me. I fumble for the light and pick up a creased newspaper article, reading it again, but this time knowing that I must go. Local group to honor famed World War II Buffalo Soldiers Regiment. I fold the newspaper carefully, and again, this sense as if I'm on a moving conveyor belt, pushing me forward. Yet as I look at the passing scenes that are in fact the scenes of my own life, I know that this is an inexorable forward movement must continue. The parts of my life that have been like empty slots waiting to be filled, a patchwork quilt not yet done, now laid out before me. But I must be the quilt maker. I must be the one who completes the picture. I looked around the large room. We were in a conference room at a nondescript hotel, the kind of place where family weddings and reunions took place, with the same standard issue red and blue carpet, the same comfortable yet decidedly unstylish furniture, clustered in small groups around the room. As I walked in, I felt suddenly uncomfortable, but before I could lose my nerve and turn back, an older gentleman caught my eye and smiled warmly. So, young man, you look much too young to have been one of us. The older black man, who appeared to be in his early 70s, smiled warmly, slapping me gently on the back. His face was creased, though not heavily lined, and his clothes and his demeanor suggested someone who had done well, someone who had taken advantage of what had been offered to him, and had claimed that which others may have sought to deny, solely because of who he was and was not. His shoes were shiny, and of soft leather and subtle craftsmanship. His dark blue blazer with a crest on the pocket, gray flannel pants, firmly creased, of almost the same color as his hair. His skin was a little darker than mine, but not by much. One might say caviolate, brown enough to know, but in his day probably considered not too brown. He introduced himself to me, shaking my hand firmly, putting his arm around my shoulder in a fatherly way. Did you have a dad or an uncle who served with us? I hesitated, not quite knowing what to say, feeling uncomfortable as if I were somehow masquerading at a ball to which I had not been invited. No, I'm just doing some research. I didn't know if my words sounded as hollow as they felt, but I still wasn't ready to tell anyone, much less to admit myself why I was here. Well, that's just fine. It was a good group of men. We lost too many of them. Way too many of them. Guys that I was in school with, we all left together, but only a few came back. But we served, and we served proudly, and those of us who were fortunate enough to have been given a chance to return to our families, well, I think we did okay. I think we did just fine. I smiled, still feeling uncomfortable, but sensing the man's pride and wanting to be part of that. I asked hesitantly, did you know someone, a chaplain? He was a Catholic priest, a Father William Grau. The man leaned back on his fine shoes, but not too much to leave a crease mark, thinking, then shaking his head. No, I don't believe that I did, but hold on. Harry over there, he's Catholic. Maybe he knew the man. He motions for his friend to come over. Introduce yourself again, young man. Joe Steele. I held out my hand, which the other man pumped warmly. Well, Joe, this is my friend Harry Flynn. Harry and I fought together. In fact, we fought together, we drank together, and we escaped with our lives together. Been friends ever since. So, Harry, Joe here is doing some research, and there's tell him the name again, Joe? Father William Grau. He was the Catholic priest and one of our chaplains, Harry. I know that you're Catholic. Thought maybe you knew him. Do you remember Father Grau? Harry was a tall man with nut brown skin, smooth and well cared for, still a full head of hair, although all gray, wavy, and thick. I could sense that he must have been the Casanova of the group in his time. Even now I caught his eye lingering on some of the younger women in the crowd. He reluctantly pulled his gaze away from the young woman, now walking out of his line of sight, and turned back to me. Father William Grau. Now that does ring a bell. I didn't know him personally, but I do believe that some of the other boys talked about him. I remember something about a Christmas Eve Mass. Yeah, something like that. Just been too many years to remember everything, but that does remind me of something that I heard about. Trying to hide my excitement, I asked eagerly. Did they say anything about him? What kind of man he was? Anything. I'm trying to put together as much as I can. Suddenly realizing that I may have said too much, Harry, or Casanova, as I like to think of him, leaned against the wall, closing his eyes for a moment, smiling, saying, I do believe that I heard about him. Fine man, a good man. Then he chuckled. Not like any priest I knew. And now, mind you, I grew up in the Catholic Church, and I love my church, but some of them were a little stiff. But Father Grau, from what I heard, as I don't remember him myself, but from what I heard, he had a good relationship with the men. He was a little older than the rest of us, and I remember some of the men affectionately called him Pops. He went that extra mile, wasn't sitting up in his ivory tower. Yeah, I remember them talking about him. He was well liked. Do you think, before I could finish my sentence, another man came up to him, cutting me off. Harry Flynn, why I can't believe it's you. Before I could say anything else, the men were embracing heartily, slapping each other on the back, reminiscing. Feeling suddenly awkward again, I excused myself, walking over to the other side of the room towards the punch bowl. As my eyes traveled around the small group, I saw men who had served their country and come back to discrimination, but despite all of that, had triumphed. The men in this room exuded a sense of success, and one could feel the weight of the contributions that they had made to their families, to the community, and I dare say, to the world. I felt proud to have a connection with them, even though it was one that I could not speak of openly. At least not yet. But somehow, being in their presence made me feel closer to that part of me that I was now being allowed to discover. It's late now, and I'm driving home to Hudson, New York, after the World Trade Center tragedy. My husband Glenn and I decided that we had to get out of the city because the place that had given me so much pleasure in my younger days seemed only to cause me pain now. I couldn't erase the images. I couldn't shake the feeling that death seemed to hang like a pall over the once vibrant place. So Glenn and I consolidated everything and moved out of the city to the picturesque Hudson River Valley. We bought a beautiful home, and it was there that I began to feel a greater sense of peace than I had in many years. And now, I wondered, was this peace too short-lived? Was I now to experience the inner turmoil of not knowing a part of me that made me, but yet was close to me? Meeting the men who had served with him had awakened that long dormant curiosity that I had long tried to deny, because to acknowledge it almost felt guilty, as if somehow I was less than grateful for the loving family that adopted me as an infant. Mama, Daddy, and my brother Billy and Otis, or Pops, as I called him, who became like a father to me after my father's death when I was 5. That cocoon of warmth enveloped me from my earliest memories. I remember the story of how Daddy and Mama and my brother Billy had gone to the orphanage, and Billy had immediately gone to where I lay in my crib, and he said, "That's the one. That's my little brother." Was I somehow betraying all that I have been given by seeking to know more? I know what Billy would say, that I had the right to know, the anger that only now was starting to subside in him for having found out about his own adoption as a teenager, an age where anger and confusion reign even in the best of us. But for me, I believe I viewed it in a different way. It wasn't that I didn't want to know, I just didn't feel like I needed to. That is until now. I had been successful, Harvard College and Harvard Business School, an investment banker, and an international consultant. But now perhaps, as we mature, we must know the complete self, the self that we present to the world and the self that was presented to us, before we became aware of who we were. And so, it is that other self that I seek in this journey. It is that other self that seeks me. I remember when I found out about her, my birth mother. I was in my 30s, and I remember contacting the agency and being told that the records were sealed. I remember having to jump through all sorts of hoops before finally I could get the information that I sought. And when I saw her name, I knew that I had to find out. Was she living? Was she dead? Had she loved me? Did she care? These thoughts tumbled back and forth in my head as I navigated the dark, inky black roads on this moonless night. I wound around trees that were heavy with rain, with branches that bent like the curved backs of old men. Thank you.